Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consol, your host. Two quick things before introducing you to my guest. First, I encourage you to subscribe to this podcast by clicking on the follow button and also clicking on the bell icon so you are alerted to each new edition of the program. Second, in addition to being the producer of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I am a novelist myself. I've written 4 books, 3 novels, and 1 short story collection. In the episode notes, you will find a short link to my Amazon page and all 4 of those titles. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight is Christine Estima. She is a playwright, a novelist, and a performer. Her debut book, The Syrian Ladies Benevolent Society, hit shelves in November 2023 and has received critical acclaim, named one of the best books of 2023. It's a short story collection. And named one of the best books of 2023, I should say, by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. So as I said, her first book is a short story collection, but her debut novel is slated to be available in September of this year, 2025. It's titled Letters to Kafka. And again, it's coming in September. She has written and appeared in many publications, the New York Times, Vice, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, New York Daily News. The list goes on. Too extensive to fully mention here. Christina Estima, welcome to the program.
I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'm happy to have you, and I gave you a little bit of a short shrift on that introduction because of what I wanted to do. You've got a really interesting background, and you do multiple things. So I wanted you to tell our listeners a little bit more about you. How would you describe what you do? Who is Christine Estima?
Oh gosh, that sounds like a question for my therapist. I
Allow me to supplement. Yes.
I have been called a polymath before because I do kind of, touch on many different creative outlets. I do like to do several different things. I've always been writing though. I remember writing short stories in like grade 1. I remember in grade 4, all of the kids had to write a short story and the kids were turning in 3 pages, 4 pages. I turned in 40, so I've always kind of been a storyteller. And I think that that's what lent itself to me being a bit of a performer. I've been cast in TV shows and I've done a lot of theater. But again, I've always kind of seen that as storytelling. It's like creating a world, just as writing is, it's creating a world. And so, I feel like I'm just an incredibly creative person and I always look for different ways to express myself creatively. These days, whenever I get up on stage, it's mostly for live storytelling and spoken word performances, which I've done all over the world. I've done them in like New York, in London, in Portugal, in Toronto. And yeah, I started professionally writing, when I was 18. I sold my first story to a newspaper and kind of never looked back and started selling short stories to literary magazines. And then that led to me writing nonfiction. So I sold essays and op-eds and editorials to a lot of the places that you mentioned, like the New York Times, the Walrus, the New York Daily News, the Observer. But fiction has always been my love, it's almost exclusively what I read. And so when I was able to finally get that all coveted book deal a few years ago, I just kind of hit the ground running. And yeah, so now very shortly after my debut collection, my debut novel is coming out.
So, what about getting an agent? You found an agent. This is what so many people strive for and often don't receive any kind of real connection there. Tell us about the experience you had when you got an agent. Can you did your agent email you back and say, "I'd like to get on the phone with you"? Obviously, he or she asked for the full manuscript. I would imagine that you had sent out. Liked what he or she saw. What happened? What was the experience like?
Well, actually, I have to say, every time I've had to tell people the story of me getting a literary agent, I always have to preface it by saying, look, I didn't do it the way you're supposed to do it. The way that you're supposed to get a literary agent is, you find out their submission information and you send off, the first 50 pages along with like a query letter, and then you wait 6 months, to hear back, and you may or may not get a full request for a manuscript. And even if you do get that, they may not sign you. I didn't do it that way because I didn't have that kind of time. So I've had two literary agents in my life. I'm currently with my second one. The first one I got because I met one of the agents at a house party. And she was brand new to the agency. And she's like, oh, I work at an agency. What do you do? And I'm like, oh, I'm an author. And she was like, amazing. We're looking for people. Send me what you got. And you're supposed to send 50 pages. I sent like 15 because I was like, I don't know who this person is. But they set up a meeting with the head agent, and they wanted to sign me right away. And I was like, okay. And so I was with that agent for a few years.
So it's all
But
about the right party to attend, right? You go to the right party, you meet the agent, and
sometimes it is, yeah.
yeah.
But for my second agent, it was even more unorthodox. I was unhappy with my first agent because I just felt like I wasn't getting the kind of care and professionalism that I was hoping for. And so while I was still with my first agent, I DM'd on Twitter, who is now my current agent, which you are not supposed to do. It is it's such a faux pas to do that. But we had been following each other for quite some time and had shared like well wishes and whatever. And I was like, look, I have an agent, but I want to switch. I'd love to meet with you. What do you say? And he was like, send me the first 50 pages. So I did, and he wrote back and he was like, okay, let's meet. And so we met like clandestinely at like this cafe that was like on the edge of town so that nobody we knew would like see us. And he was
In
like,
what city was this?
oh, I live in Toronto.
Toronto.
So
So you met with him in Toronto. Okay.
yeah, so I met with him in Toronto, and he said to me, he's like, I want to sign you, but you need to tell your agent that you're done like right now. And he's like, that's the only way I can sign you. And so I literally went home and emailed my first agent, and I was like, we need to end our professional relationship. And he wished me well, and that was that. And so yeah, now I'm with my current agent, and this was before I'd ever had a book deal, right? Like I got the agent just both agents just based off of the strength of my manuscripts. So
Now, my understanding is that unless you're a known author, trying to sell a short story collection is a dead end, or normally a dead end. Your first fiction collection was, or your first book was a collection of short stories. Did they ever say to you that, I don't really represent short stories, or why don't you write a novel? I mean, how did it all play?
well, it's interesting because I've heard that a lot too, and I outright dismiss it because I don't really see that in the industry. Short story collections are like blowing off of the bookshelves these days. People love short story collections. So I kind of dismiss that narrative, even though that is really popular, and I did hear that. With my agent, however, I hadn't actually written that collection when I signed with him. Before I ever sold my debut book, I had written three other manuscripts. And my agent, bless his soul, pitched those manuscripts to like 40 different publishers across North America, and nobody wanted them. And so I've always just kind of been like, well, I'm not going to rest on my laurels. I'm just going to write the next thing. And so I wrote the collection. My agent was really supportive of it. He did suggest to me that it could be made into a novel, but I said I wanted to do a collection, and he supported me all the way. And
You mean
my
because there was continuity between the stories, that he suggested that because there's continuity, you could actually, create a mosaic that's a full novel?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, my debut book is called The Syrian Ladies Benevolent Society, and all the stories are linked. The book basically follows one family as they leave the Middle East in the 19th century and then settle in Montreal in the 20th century, and then it follows their descendants all the way through to the 21st century, so you can like track the family through time. And I felt like yes, it could be a novel, but I actually feel like writing short stories is much more of a challenge. In a novel, you have all the time in the world to develop plot and character. But in a short story, you cannot waste a minute of the reader's time. Like every single line has to be of some useful employment, and so it's a much more difficult medium. And I always welcome a challenge. And I was lucky. I got a book deal basically right out the gate with that one. So after years and years of manuscripts that just couldn't sell, it was my short story collection that got my name on the books, you know?
Well, those are some great stories you just told us. Um, Experientially, one of the questions I want to ask you is experientially, how does writing short stories differ from a novel? Now, you did say that the short stories are much harder, and
Yeah.
that you need more economy. I suppose more directness, and it needs to be streamlined. It needs to be economical. Every line counts, and so on.
Hmm.
So, would you write another short story collection, or are you committed to novels at this point?
I'm definitely not opposed to it. I would say that right now, the current work in progress that I have on the go is another novel, but I'm definitely not opposed to another short story collection. I think that they're amazing. I love reading them myself. I have tons of short story collections on my shelf. They're great for like, when you're just trying to get from like point A to point B on the train or on the plane or on the bus. They're just like a perfect little pocket story. So I'm definitely not opposed to it, but it's not on my radar right now.
Why do you think they're flying off the shelves now? Because that wasn't always the case. What
Mm.
do you think it's? I mean, I'll throw out a little speculation of my own. We're living in this age of social media where everything's quick hit. I mean, young people don't even watch TV shows anymore. What they do is that they just get the clips of, say, Saturday Night Live on TikTok or Instagram, and that's what they see, and they don't want to watch the rest of the show. Really, it's all the good stuff is isolated and put on social media. It's quick hit. Now that's video, but even writing, I mean, people write very short items on social media. Do you think the mentality has changed in that way?
I think you've kind of, struck something there because I do think that now our attention spans are shorter. And I'm not going to lie, like I'm currently reading a novel right now. Sometimes when I start a new chapter, I actually look to see how many pages the chapter is until the next chapter. And I'm like, okay, can I get through all of this in one sitting or am I going to have to break this up? Like, you know what I mean? Like
Yes.
it's difficult sometimes to hold a reader's attention for a long span, especially if a chapter is like 40 pages. I think you're asking a lot of your reader right there, you know?
Yeah,
So yeah,
it can be.
I think there is something to that. I think that, we live in a time now where messages can be sent off into the ether without much thought or much care. We no longer write letters through the post. It's all like, text message or email. And we don't really have to think about communication. We don't have to think about entertainment medium as something to actually sit through. Like, how many times have you gone to the cinema and someone's pulling out their phone in the middle of it and you're just like, ah, you know?
Yeah.
Or even in live theater, that happens. And they have to have now announcements in the theater. Like when you go see a play, like, hey, turn off your damn phones.
Yeah. Oh, that's
Um,
really disruptive. And I remember I heard a phone went off. It was a play that Kevin Spacey was in back before he fell from grace, and
mm.
he turned and said, tell him you'll call him back." And then he just continued acting. Yeah, he
I
was
mean,
annoyed, but
yeah.
he just went right back to in character and kept going. I'm sure the crowd loved hearing it, but
Yeah.
conversely, Christine, the shorter attention span. Then I think when it comes to a novel, that's a long story, and I'm
Mm.
thinking how many pages. Now your novel, the new one, or actually your only one, since the other one's short story collection, Letters to Kafka, is
Mm.
384 pages. That's not
Mhm.
a tome. It's not a
No,
doorstopper.
no.
So it's reasonable, but I think some people sometimes look at books and think, the shorter a novel and say the shorter the better. So
Mm,
maybe that's working against selling novels. I don't know. I've always been of the belief that, I mean, you not only need patience, but you need imagination. If you don't have a good imagination, reading is not the same experience because
mm,
you're not really seeing anything. You're not seeing the imagery isn't there for the
mm,
person with a poor imagination or a non-existent one. So,
mm.
I
Well,
mean,
fingers crossed my book finds the people that
yes.
have the span for that, you know?
Well, I love the title. Let's talk about, let's start with letters to Kafka,
Yeah.
and then we'll get to your story collection as well, which you've touched
Hmm.
on just a little bit.
Hmm.
Are you a Franz Kafka reader and fan, or was he just handy for the purposes of this novel?
I have to say, I never was. And to this day, I still wouldn't consider myself a scholar. I was mostly interested in the alternative point of view of this story. So, Letters to Kafka retells the great love story of Franz Kafka's life, but it tells it from the woman's perspective. And her name was Milena Jesenská. And she was a Czech writer, and she wrote to him asking if she could translate his works from German into Czech so his own people could read him. And in doing so, she became Kafka's first ever translator. But it was in writing to him that they struck up this epistolary love affair. And so I have to say, I was much more interested in her, and I basically became a scholar on her. When I look at the research that I had to do for this book, I do kind of see Kafka as ancillary in a way, like he's more of he's a name, he's the name
Hmm.
drop, he's the hook. It's really more about her. And so while I do think that the themes that Kafka was working with in his writing and in his books is definitely present in this story. It's not really about him. Although I did have to, definitely do a lot of research on his life to make sure that it was historically accurate from that sense.
So it's fictionalized, but you sought to make sure it's historically accurate at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I weave in little known facts and then I kind of take it three times around the dance floor. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? So
I like
like,
that. That's a
so
nice turn
for,
of phrase.
yeah.
So,
Um,
what about? I mean, it's clever in the sense, and I'm not accusing you of artifice, but it's clever in the sense that the title is uh, the cover itself is provocative. It's a sexy cover, and your
mm,
short story collection also has a sexy cover. They both, I mean,
mhm.
there's a continuity between the covers.
Yeah, don't you love that? I'm
I
so glad
do.
that that worked out that way.
I do. I mean, I could see all of your works kind of following that model because it's almost
Yeah,
like
that was done
a
on
Christine
purpose.
Estima novel,
Yeah.
Estima novel. When you see the cover, you know right
Yeah.
away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Those the pictures on the cover of both books was very intentional because I am really tired of looking at historical fiction covers where the woman is walking away, the woman is looking away. It's like a
mhm.
disembodied woman, like you never see her face. She's always walking away from the cover. And instead, I am much more interested in seeing women who are def like daring you to look them in the eye and be like, look at me. I am in the throes of perhaps like my empowerment, my sexual ecstasy. I am not the object. I am the subject. Look at me. I bet I can make
Mhm.
you look away. And that was to me really, really important.
Yeah, there's
And
power there.
yeah, there's a lot of power there. And I think with the first cover, it's actually a really funny story. I'll tell you briefly. I saw the picture that ended up being on the cover of Syrian Ladies Benevolent Society. I saw it on Instagram about a decade ago. And I saved it because I thought it was fantastic. And so when it came to choosing a cover, my publisher was like, do you have any ideas? Now, normally authors don't really get a say in what their cover looks like, but my publisher is very collaborative. And I was like, well, here's this picture. I really like it. And they loved it. They flipped out and they were like, how can we license this? Well, the reason why I saw it on Instagram all those years ago is because the photographer, who is now a huge photographer and she's exhibited at like, World Photo Day and she's been spreads in magazines and all that stuff. I went to junior high with her. And so I messaged her on Facebook and I was like, can my publisher license this photo from you?
Hmm.
And she was like, yeah, absolutely. And so when it came to choosing the cover for the second novel, my publisher suggested this as kind of like continuity with the first book because while the two books are wildly different and a huge departure from each other, they both deal with themes of women's voices, women's stories, women's agency, women's volition, women's sexuality. And that was really important to me. And so I'm really glad that like we kind of have this continuity between books.
Now, is this a self-portrait of the photographer, or is
No,
that
that was a model.
a model? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. That would have been even more exciting for her if it had been a self-portrait. But it's a great cover, and both of the
Yeah.
covers, yeah, you definitely get the feminine power
Mm.
that's conveyed. The sexiest novel, well, it's not technically a novel. The sexiest book I've ever read was written by a woman. It's Henry and June
Oh,
about
yes.
from an you know it. Okay, you know,
Yeah.
and I was going to ask you, did that influence you at all? Because it isn't analogous to Franz, and he's got a translator there who he has what the notes say is a torrid love affair. Henry
Yeah.
Miller and
Anais
June
Nin.
and Naeus Nin exactly
Yeah.
had definitely had a torrid love affair.
Yeah.
Although she was voracious, I mean, she was what do you call it? Polyamorous, really. It
Hmm.
wasn't just him. I mean, I love
Hmm.
some of the stuff that she said just about, and I don't think it was in the book. It was just quotes from her about just refusing to live an ordinary life, and she wanted every moment of her life to be, a true experience or a true adventure. So she
Mm.
was a bad girl for her time.
Mm.
Or even today, you would be considered a bad girl or bad guy if you did something like, you were polyamorous the way she was.
Mm.
But I'm kind of digressing here. It wasn't influential at all to you.
It's interesting that you draw those links because it wasn't. I actually wasn't thinking about that, but now that you kind of say that, I'm like, hmm. Was that
Maybe
somewhere in the back of my
subliminally.
brain? Yeah, maybe. I have to say, I think I was more influenced by Milena's story herself. I just found her to be so balls out and brave and brash and so outlandish and ostentatious in a time when, not only were women not allowed to behave in those ways, but, this book takes place right as the Great War has ended. She's living in Vienna, which is a capitulated city. There are bread lines and coal shortages and fuel shortages, and electricity lines have been cut, and men are coming back from the front with hastily patched up faces and phantom limbs, and women are selling their bodies on the street just to pay their way for their family. And Milan is like, you know what? I'm gonna be an author. And it's like, it's just so ostentatious. And I loved that about her. I just
Yeah.
dug that about her. And so I was more inspired by Milana's true story. And when I was thinking of other books that I think kind of work in tandem with mine, I would have to say The Paris Wife by Paula McLean, which came out, oh, quite some time ago now, maybe 15 years ago now. And that book retells the marriage between Ernest Hemingway and his first wife, Hadley, but it's told from Hadley's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this other book called Zed, which is the story of Zelda Fitzgerald rather than F. Scott Fitzgerald's story. And so that one as well, I think, is more comparable to what I was trying to achieve with this book.
Interesting. So, let's talk about the Syrian Ladies Benevolent Society. You touched on it earlier. It's a short story collection. Uh, Again, sexy cover, powerful cover, and tell us about give us some love for the audience.
Well, touching on what I said before, it's a collection that is all, each chapter is told from the perspective of one member of this Middle Eastern family. They leave the Middle East in the mid 19th century. They settle in Montreal in the 20th century, and we follow the family all the way through to the 21st century. And so this collection was kind of inspired by the stories of my family. Of course, it's all fictionalized, so there's maybe like a kernel of truth in every story, but the rest of it is all just my imagination taking hold.
Hmm.
But it's also, there have been a lot of instances in the past few years where I realized that there really was a kind of hunger for these types of stories. And I'll be really specific here. I'm sure in California you probably didn't get the news, but in Canada, around 2019, there was a huge scandal here because there was a TV personality. His name is Don Cherry, and he hosted a show on TV called Coach's Corner, where they talk about hockey. And it's basically like, yeah, in the middle of like in between periods, they would break down the game. And he's known as like an infamous blowhard, but the show had been on for like 40, 50 years. It was a big deal. And then during one of his rants about, which wasn't about hockey, he said that, you people, in quotation, come to Canada for our milk and honey, quote unquote, but you won't wear the poppy and you don't celebrate Remembrance Day and you don't honor our troops. And when he said that, he ended up being fired for those comments. But when he said that, it was a huge punch in the gut for me because my jiddo is the Arabic word for grandfather. He was
Hmm.
one of the few Arabs in the Canadian army that fought during the Second World War for Canada. And he was a gunner and he killed every fascist he saw. And when, he fought in the infamous bloody Battle of Ortona, where the Canadians engaged the Nazis for over a week in Christmas 1943, and the Canadians emerged victorious. And when he finally came home, he was deaf in one ear, he had shrapnel in his back, and an extreme case of shell shock. We now call it PTSD. And he didn't do all of that so that someone like Don Cherry could make these egregious comments, about, immigrants and also our troops. And
Yeah.
so I did what anybody does when they're enraged. I tweeted about it.
Of course.
Of course. And I sent it off into the ether in the middle of the night. And when I woke up the next morning, it had gone viral. And suddenly I'm being interviewed on live national news about my jiddo, and I'm on radio talking about my jiddo. And I was like, oh, it was interesting to me because I realized people don't know. Like, they don't know that we've been in Canada for centuries. They don't know that we've contributed to the fabric of this country. And what a shame it would have been had we never come here. And so I decided to write a nonfiction essay about my family for a really great magazine based out of Montreal called Maisonneuve Magazine. And when that article was published, suddenly I'm doing a 20-minute in-depth interview on CBC and I'm being written about again. And I was like, okay, there's clearly an appetite for these stories. And people really didn't know the tapestry and the legacy that Arabs have in Canada and by extension North America. When people hear Arab Canadian or in your case, Arab American, they think it's a new phenomenon. They think of the Syrian refugee crisis, which is a serious crisis, but they don't realize how long we've been here. And so, like I said before, fiction has always been my first love. So I just applied it, and the Syrian Ladies Benevolent Society was born.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an issue that's all over the world these days. It's really sad. And here in the United States, Silicon Valley was built largely by Indians and Chinese, not
Steve
just
Jobs was a Syrian.
yeah, exactly. He
There you go.
his biological father was
Was Syrian.
Syrian, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's well, it's one of those things. This time will pass, I'm sure. We've been here before. Every immigrant group that's come to the United States, including the Germans and the Italians and the Irish, were,
Mm,
the Mexicans are just the Italians of this time. But
mm.
I'm full-blood Italian, even though my name's been truncated. So it's just, I know what my grandparents did when they came to this country, and it's sad that people see them as something other than or less than.
Hmm.
So yeah, I want to back up a minute to letters to Kafka because did you actually in the research did you actually get your hands on letters from what's her name again? Her first.
Milena Jesenská.
There you go.
So this is a basic hook of the book is that after both of them had passed, Kafka's letters to her were published in a very famous book in the 1950s called Letters to Milena. But her letters to him, we don't know what happened to them. They've been lost to time. So in my book, I imagine what her letters to him might have said.
Yes. Yes. And so you channeled her as best you could based on what you knew about him and her. And that's
Yeah,
what
it
makes
was a
it a
lot. It was
fictional account,
4 years of research.
or
It was
semi-fictional account, I should say.
I mean, I have to say everything's, made up. There's no, I mean, apart from the fact that like we know certain plot points, like we know certain things did happen. But when it comes to her correspondence to him, when it comes to, we also know that they met up twice for two lovers' trysts, but we don't know what happened on those trysts. There's no real written account of it in his diaries or in her letters to other people. We don't really know what happened. So again, I imagine what happened on those trysts. A lot of it is, it's fiction it's historical fiction, so it's like it's based on things that we know happened and then I just kind of run with it. So it was a lot of research. I did, countless visits to both Vienna and Prague. I scoured through every single historical text I could get my hands on, and that included not just like letters, but also census records, voter rolls, passenger manifests, wartime, declassified wartime documents. I did a lot of research on site at a lot of the museums that are dedicated to Kafka. I visited both of, her known addresses, his known addresses, grave sites, concentration camps. And I was even able to interview one of her biographers. And so, like, it was 4 years of nonstop research. And so I really wanted to be comfortable with the material because it is, when I first got the idea for this book, it was overwhelming. I was like, there's no way I can do this. Like, it's just too much.
Well, I was going to
But
ask you, did you start writing along the way, or did you do all the research first to the point where you really had no choice but to write it? Because why would you have invested all that time if you didn't say, look, even if this is a tough assignment, I'm gonna forge ahead and make sure it comes through.
Well, I'm incredibly tenacious. So as soon as I had the idea, I was like, I'm doing it. But no, I wasn't writing when I was researching. I was purely researching. And it
Hmm.
was at the end of 4 years, I decided to draft the outline because I felt at that point that I was like, okay, I'm really comfortable with the material now. And I don't normally outline my manuscripts, nor sometimes I can find that to be really constricting. But with this type of manuscript, you do have certain plot points you need to hit because they're in the historical record. So my outline ended up being like 20,000 words.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like this big, massive document. And that's when I realized I was like, the book is actually already in my head. I just have to get it out. And that was the tough part, was like it was all in my head. It was all mapped out. It was just making sure I was using the words that I needed to use and telling the story that I needed to tell. So yeah.
So, what do you think or is the characteristic that you possess that was indispensable to you getting to where you've gotten to this point? Now, you mentioned tenacity.
Mm.
That must be one of them. But if you were to pick another one, what other characteristic would you say I really need this? I mean, this is kind of linchpin. If I didn't have this, I'm not sure that I would, have gotten this far.
Well, I always say this to emerging or aspiring authors who come to me looking for advice. And I say to them, like, talent is going to be your number one asset, but you need more than that because I know a lot of talented authors who got a stack of rejection letters and then just gave up because they were like, well, this isn't for me. Because instead, you need rejection to propel you forward rather than let it hold you back. So
Hmm.
you need drive, you need ambition, and you need patience because this is a slow industry. It's not like, I hear of people all the time who are in bands and they record an album in a weekend and the next day it's up on Spotify and then it's streaming and it's getting like 1,000 streams or something like that. Books aren't like that. Like you'll be writing it for years, it'll be in edits for years, and then when you get a book deal, it's still 2 years in the pipeline before it hits the shelves. So things are incredibly slow in this industry. So if you don't have thick skin, if you're not ambitious, and if you're not patient, you won't get anywhere. I don't care how talented you are. So I think I have all of those things because I am incredibly ambitious. I've always been really driven. And I took time, I really took the time to hone my voice and my style and the kind of thematic plots that I want to touch upon in my work. As I said before, like my body of work is almost always exclusively dealt with the stories and voices of women. And that's kind of my jumping off point really for any sort of fiction that I want to approach. And so sometimes, you get a debut author and they're like 18 years old and, they don't really know, what their style is or what their voice is or what their talent is or what their style is. And you can see that sometimes in the work. So I always say like, make sure you take the time to really kind of discover what your voice is.
What is your writer's voice? If you were to slap a few adjectives around that, how would you describe your writer's voice?
Bestseller?
Aha.
Just kidding. Can you imagine? Um,
I don't know, with Kafka in the title alone, I think you're going to get a lot of people pulling it off the shelves and putting
well,
money
fingers
down.
crossed. I mean, that is the
Yeah.
hope, right? How would I describe my style? I mean, I do think that my style is oh gosh, that's a difficult question. What
Well,
is my style?
most people, I ask this question sometimes, and a lot of times people say, "Oh, it changes all the time because uh, you know, I make it sympathetic or empathetic to the material I'm writing." But I know that there's writers who spend many years trying to identify what is their real voice, and then they write in that voice, and it's very identifiable. I mean, like Pat Conroy certainly's got a particular voice. Hemingway had a voice.
Mm-hmm.
I think Barbara Kingsolver, people
Mm-hmm.
would say she's got,
Yeah.
when you read Barbara Kingsolver,
Demon
it's
Copperhead.
her. There
Yeah.
you go. There you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah, for sure. Or
Among
like
others.
Sally Rooney has a really distinct voice.
Yes.
Dickens has a really distinct voice.
Yes. Yeah, that's been widely emulated. Uh,
Mm.
so when you're at a cocktail party and somebody says, "What do you do?" and you say, "Well, I'm a writer. I write. Or let's say I'm a novelist." Um, and they say, "Oh, what kind of novels do you write?"
I
What
say literary fiction.
literary fiction?
Yeah,
Okay.
people, it's so funny though, too, because when I say that I'm a novelist, people are like, oh, cool. So, like, do you write like romantasy or like, 50 Shades of Vampires or whatever it is the kids are reading, And I'm like those books are fantastic. But you know what I mean? But when I say literary fiction, people are like, dunno. Like, they have no idea what that is because the popular fiction these days is like having sex with dragons or whatever it is. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, literary fiction, yeah, it doesn't sell as well as the commercial stuff, typically, but you do have exceptions to that, like the Goldfinch or
Yeah.
the All the Light We Cannot See,
Hmm.
novels like
Yeah, I
that.
loved that book.
It was so gorgeously
Oh, it was
written, and
beautiful, that book.
just the
Devastating
whole
too.
march towards, when is this blind little girl going to meet this German
Mm,
kid who has been
mm,
kind of dragged into the whole German effort to try to take over Europe.
mm. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm like I read so much and it's interesting like every book even if it's described as literary fiction is like its own little world. It's like its own little pocket. And I love that. And so I guess with my literary fiction, I hope that people will see it as Estima's world.
Yes.
You know?
What was a turning point in your writing life? Was there a point at which you had some kind of breakthrough? Maybe you identified your voice. You suddenly realized this is it. I finally stopped trying to sound like a novelist and let the voice that's in my chest come out.
Hmm.
I mean,
Oh,
I don't want
that's
to
an
supply. I
interesting
feel like I'm
question.
supplying words for you now, but I don't. I'm just wondering if there was. It could have even been a writing coach that you spent time with, or a retreat where it's like, wow, eureka!
I have found the channel.
There was a moment. This was a long time ago. I was maybe selling like one short story a year if I was lucky. I was not doing very well. And my stories in the beginning were about these epic, overwrought, histrionic type, like big, big themes, you know? Um, and I think that when you're trying to sell short stories to literary magazines, that's not necessarily going to be what they're looking for, you know?
Hmm.
And I found that I went traveling for a while and I lived in Europe on and off for about a decade. And when I came back to Canada, I started selling stories left, right, and center. Like I couldn't, like I was literally saying no to people at one point because they were like multiple submissions and simultaneous submissions, and they were all coming back to me like, "We want this story. No, we want this story." And I think what changed was is I decided, or I made the conscious choice to write about those small, quiet, imperceptible moments in life rather than the big overarching themes. Um, and that really struck a chord, I think, with a lot of readers at the literary magazines. One story, I remember this so vividly, it was accepted by three different magazines. Now, that never happens. It had never happened to me before. And so I literally had to turn down two different magazines. And then, so one of the magazines that I turned down, they were like, okay, but do you have anything else? Because we just love your style. And I was like, well, I have this story, but it hasn't been edited. And they were just like, done, sold. Like, you know what I mean? So I think that once I kind of realized that I didn't have to be writing like an epic, like it didn't have to be Braveheart, it didn't have to be The English Patient, it could be, something small and like quiet. I call them quiet stories, because nothing massive happens. It's all about those quiet inner moments. Like there was this one story I sold. It was called Discussion Questions for Your Book Club. And the story is framed as when you're at the back of a novel and it says discussion questions for your book club.
Hmm.
So the
Hmm.
whole entire story is framed in those questions. And you follow this character as she's kind of like asking these questions of herself and of the readers. And that story did really well. There was this other story that was just about a couple that bought this typewriter and they're trying to figure out who owned the typewriter before them. Like small moments. I think my most popular story was what was it called? The title. Oh, it was called Your Hands Are Blessed. It's in the Syrian Ladies Benevolent Society now. And that story was about a woman who sponsors her sitto. Sitto is the Arabic word for grandmother. Her sitto is in Damascus, and she sponsors her to come to Montreal. And it's just about that transition of going from Damascus to trying to find her life in Montreal, really. And the Cito sees, those ladies that walk up and down the street going through your bins and pulling out the empties and pulling out the cans. And then they go and they go and return them for the refund, which is like 5 cents or 10 cents and whatever, and that's how
Hmm.
they make money. So the Cito sees those women going up and down the streets doing that, and she decides to join them, and she doesn't tell her granddaughter about that. And it's just about, the granddaughter finds out but doesn't confront her, and the grandmother never tells her, and that's what the story is. And that story it ended up being included in the anthology Best Canadian Stories 2023. And so that's always what's been really surprising to me is I realized my voice when I realized I didn't have to write this big overarching epic. It can be about those small moments in someone's life that I think
Hmm.
really resonate with readers.
Hmm. Hmm. Talk about your writing regimen. When you are in, like for instance, Letters to Kafka, once your research was done and then you were bearing down on the writing, uh, what's your process like? Are you a morning writer, an evening writer? How much time do you put
Mm.
in? Is there a place that you do your work? Or do you go to coffee shops? Are you a person who moves around a bit?
Mm. Yeah, I'm going to talk in general, and then I'm going to talk about what Letters to Kafka was like. So in general, I am not highly regimented like some authors. I know lots of authors who like wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and they get their pages in, and then they are able to go about the rest of their day, or others that are night owls. When I'm writing just kind of, like for example, the current manuscript that I'm working on, I always write the first draft by hand. I don't know why, but it has to be in my notebooks by hand. There's something tangible about actually scratching the words into the page that just kind of makes it more real
Hmm.
to me. But I will do it, yeah, at coffee shops. I've joined a few of those. This group that's all has chapters all around the world, and it's called Shut Up and Write. And these people, complete strangers, will just meet up at a library, a cafe, wherever, and literally they're just like, okay, it's shut up and write, and people just shut up and write, and then you don't have to share what you've written afterwards, which is great because I don't want to. And I've joined those. I've joined those types of writing groups. It's mostly just scratching it out in my notebooks by hand, and then once I've done that, then I'll take it to the computer where I can polish it and edit it as I go and fashion it into, the format that I want. That's generally what I do. But Letters to Kafka was completely different from anything I've ever done. I normally, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, when you're writing, it can be a pride swallowing siege, and that blinking cursor of death is just staring at you like, who do you think you are? You can't write. What the hell is this nonsense? But Letters to Kafka, I would wake up every day and it was a joy to sit down at my laptop and go to work because every day I got to be with Milena. That was the feeling. Like I was so, after all the research was done, I was so enamored with her. I was so in love with her that I was just like, I get to be with Milena today. That's all I care about. And so it was a joy. Like I was able to bang out this manuscript so quickly. Here's a funny anecdote. So I was 150 pages into writing this manuscript, and I hit a bit of a wall where I felt like I don't know, I just wasn't doing my best. And so I went back to Vienna and I spent about 3 weeks to a month there. And the reason I went back is because I got a house sit. I love to do house sitting when I travel. This way I don't have to pay for accommodation anywhere I go. I just look after people's pets while they go on holiday. And so I was looking after this dog in Vienna, and the apartment was located on Lerchenfelder Straße. Now I knew that when Milena lived in Vienna, she lived on Lerchenfelder Straße. But Lerchenfelder Straße is a really long street. And I didn't really think much of it because I was like, well, there's no way I'm going to be near her. When I got to the flat, it was directly across the street from where Milena lived 100 years ago. And so every day, I had to walk the dog 3 times a day. I would just walk by her apartment block and I was like, hi, Milena. Good afternoon,
Hmm.
Milena. Good night, Milena. I would look up at her window. I would go around the back to where this park was. One time I was walking the dog at night and someone had left the door to her apartment block open. And so I scooped up the dog and ran inside. And I was like, oh my God, I'm in Milena's stairwell. Like it was so exciting to me. And so when I got back to Toronto at the end of that month, the manuscript went from 150 pages to 400 in the space of 30 days. I was blowing through it. I was so inspired. And so this manuscript was like just a joy and a delight. It was nothing like I'd ever experienced before.
Well, that is great to hear.
Mm.
So it sounds, I mean, having done this and it working so well for you, um, is this going to become a potential model? Not that you would do the necessarily the same sort of thing, but do you feel that tying yourself to research into a historical figure, a not that well known historical figure at that,
Mm.
is something that's going to work for you in the future? Or maybe I should ask you, what are you working on now? I mean, that might answer the question right there.
Well, I have to say, it's an interesting question because I'm not really sure. It's hard to kind of plan those types of things, I suppose. The manuscript that I'm working on now, does deal with the historical record, but it takes place right now. It's more about how the things that happened in the past can influence things that are happening now. I don't want to say too much because I'm not sure. I mean, I really hope that this next manuscript comes to fruition, but I don't know. And I'm very superstitious about
Mm.
talking too much about, my manuscripts because I just feel like I'm going to jinx it if I do. Um, but I think if I ever do tackle something as immersive in the historical record as this, that I probably will follow this same format.
Hmm.
But right now, I'm still obsessed with history. I'm such a history nerd. Like early 20th century history is my thing. And so the manuscript that I'm working on now does deal with early 20th century history and how it's affecting things now. So yeah, I loved doing this one. So I hope in the future, if ever I tackle something similar, then yeah, it'll hopefully it'll be the same process.
Now, you mentioned that you did a major outline, 20,000 word outline,
Yeah.
and that you really prefer organic writing,
Mm,
which doesn't, I mean, the historical aspect doesn't lend itself as well to the organic stuff, it sounds like,
exactly.
because you really
Exactly.
have to, yeah, you're concerned about the progression, the timing, the milestones and all that. So,
Mm.
you know, in a sense, it sounds like there's a more freedom in doing something that's straight fiction.
There is definitely more freedom. And kind of when I always say this to aspiring authors or emerging authors that like, do not wait for inspiration to strike. It is in the act of writing that inspiration comes. So your first page is always going to be crap. And that's part of the fun. Like you know what I mean? You can go back and discard it later or edit it later. But it's in writing that the story will take you where it needs to go. And so that's kind of the ethos that I've always lived by when writing my other manuscripts is that it was in writing it that I realized, oh, this is what it's about. This is where it has to go, rather than what I had pre-planned. Historical fiction, as I mentioned, like you do have certain, historical plot points you need to hit. And so it constrains you in that way. Although this didn't feel like a constraint, this was just a joy every day to write. But yeah, I do kind of prefer being able to go to those places deep within ourselves that we don't like to talk about. There are a lot of aspects of the Syrian Ladies Benevolent Society and also of Letters to Kafka that are provocative, that can
Hmm.
push people's buttons, that, might make them raise an eyebrow. And that's done intentionally. I'm not here to write stories about people who have the exact same ethics and morals that I do as a 21st century Western woman. That doesn't interest me. I'm here to write stories about people who are complicated, about people who are nuanced, about people who are making mistakes, and people who are trying to figure it out, and people who almost do. And that's why you root for them is because they're trying so hard. And that's what interests me.
Hmm.
And those are the stories that I'm always going to write. I'm never going to write like a Colleen Hoover type
Right,
book.
right.
Now, don't get me wrong, a Colleen Hoover, people love reading them on the beach when they go on holiday. They're great for what they are. Like anything that gets people excited about reading books, I'm all for it. But I'm just never going to write those things. I'm never going to write that book about the girl who's just like she's ethereally beautiful, but she's a klutz, and she just happens to fall into the arms of this perfect man who she cannot stand his guts, but they just end up with the perfect match. Or like, I'm never going to write that. Those
Right.
books are fun and they're perfect for a time and place, but I'm not interested in that.
No, I get it. I
You
get
know what I
it.
mean? Yeah.
So if you were having a dinner party at your house and you had an opportunity to invite any three novelists, living or dead,
Oh, geez.
um, who would your three guests be?
Oh, man. You saddled me with this one, didn't you? God, just three? Living or dead? Oh, come on, even the dead
You have
ones?
expanded the opportunities there.
Oh,
Let's
geez. Okay.
revisit that. Unless you've got an answer right now, I can double
No, I
back to
don't
that
have
one.
an answer right now, but
Okay.
like I kind of have like ideas and
Well,
gosh.
I'll double back to that one.
Okay, double back, double
I'm going to
back.
give you another one here, and that is,
Okay.
how do you, this is a speculative question. How do you expect your writing to change or evolve as you grow older? I mean, you've seen evolution in your writing, no doubt, from your youth to, I mean, you're still
Mm.
very young, but to this point, and no doubt your writing will evolve in some way. Do you have any sense for how your writing will change as you move into your later years?
That's interesting because over the past 20 years, I've noticed because I feel much stronger as an author and I kind of know myself better than I did when I was in my 20s or in my 30s. I feel like my writing over the past 20 years has become less self-conscious. It's not, I'm not concerned with handing every single moment to the reader on a platter. Like I'm not going to over-explain things or, I allow the reader
How did that
to
happen? Yeah, you're saying you're allowing the reader to fill in.
Yeah,
You're
I allow
giving,
the like
respecting
my
their,
writing is very much like consumed and obsessed with imagery, very
hmm
much the way that visual art over the past few centuries is more concerned with imagery and iconography and what those images symbolize rather than just taking them at face value. And I have a lot of that in my writing because I love using that as a device to explain other things about the character or the plot or where things are going to go. For example, in Letters to Kafka, no spoiler or anything, but jackdaws play a huge plot point in the book, which you only understand at the very end of it, why there are jackdaws at every single pivotal moment in this book.
hmm
And so I'm not going to spoil it here, but that was really important to me, And so I think that being able to have that imagery in a book was something that I would have been really self-conscious about as a writer 20 years ago. And I would have over-explained it so that, readers aren't stupid. That's the main thing that you learn is that like you don't have to talk down to them. They get it. They get the subtlety. And
Yeah.
I think my biggest strength has been leaning into the subtleties.
Yeah, and readers, particularly readers of literary fiction, they're an intelligent set of people.
Mm,
I mean, more so than your
yeah.
typical nonfiction book or certainly self-help book or maybe commercial fiction. Again, nothing against commercial fiction, like you were saying.
Yeah.
It's always nice to get a paycheck, but at the same time, I think it's
Yeah.
a different grouping of people. It's not
Yeah.
the same demo or
Yeah.
demographic between literary and commercial.
Mm.
How did you come to that? How did that dawn on you when you decided, I'm not going to over explain. I'm going to keep things leaner than that, and I'm going to give the reader room to co-create with me?
Honestly, it's literally just reading other books. Like, I always, always tell this to emerging authors. It's like, you want to be a good writer, you have to read. Because it is through reading other people's works that you discover what is good fiction and what is bad fiction, what is good writing and what is bad writing. And how many times have I read a book and I was like, I could do that, and so I just did. Like I just went out and I was like, I could write something better than that. So I did. I wrote something better than it. You have to read you because that is the true mark of an author is someone who reads everything they can get their hands on. Like I'm blowing through books this year and last year, like I was just blowing through books because like everything all these different styles, all these different voices out there. It's just such a joy to kind of learn more about the craft by seeing what other people are doing.
Hmm
And there are a lot of authors out there, I'm not going to name any of them, of course, but they should not have book deals because they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And it's through
Yeah.
reading that you kind of realize this is didactic,
Mhm.
like this is, pedantic. This is not what it's like. Some of it is just babbling. Like, some of it is just like, did you not have an editor? Like, how did this make it past the editor and the copy editor and the proofreader? Like, this is terrible.
Yeah.
You really do have to read other writing in order to kind of discover the voice that you want to have. And if you don't want to be like those authors out there that you feel haven't written a good book, then that's the only way to do it, really, is by reading. You have to read.
Yeah. Yeah. What about your professional bucket list? What do you want to accomplish by time you hang up the pen or the word processor? I mean, maybe short of winning a Nobel or a Pulitzer, um, what do you want to have accomplished?
Honestly, I remember when I sold a story to the New York Times and I got a message from this little girl. Well, little girl, she was a teenager. And she told me she had read my story in the New York Times and it spoke to her and it really inspired her. And I just remember thinking, what greater compliment is there? There
Hmm.
really is nothing else. Like, that's all as a creative person, whether it's doing something on stage or it's doing something on the page, all I want is to be able, to have someone say to me, your words meant something to me, your story moved me. Like, there is no greater compliment. Then that's all there is in this life,
Yeah.
is hoping that we can affect each other in a positive way. And all I want is for, if ever there is a Wikipedia page about me, and if ever there is an historical record about me, it'll just be that, Christine wrote stories that touched people's hearts. That's all I care about.
Yeah. And or inspire to other authors. It's a beautiful thing to be emulated. People say, I mean, you've had people who inspire you, the people who you invited to your dinner party at your house, the three novelists who inspired you.
Yes, yes. Okay,
Um,
I think I can answer that question.
okay.
Definitely Milena Jesenská, the
Hmm.
heroine of my book Letters to Kafka. Definitely the very first adult, or I guess young adult novel that I ever read that really opened my eyes to what books could be was a Canadian author. Her name is Martha Brooks. And she wrote this young adult book in the early 90s called Two Moons in August. And it's about this young girl whose mother has just died of tuberculosis. And so it's about, growing up, but it's also about pain and mourning and healing and hope, all the good things. But up until I had read that book, when you're a child, especially when you're a little girl, the books that are marketed to you are like 30 ways of flirting, how to get a date, like fiction books, but like they're all about like, shopping and hanging out with your friends and like Sweet Valley High nonsense. This was the first book that I ever read that was marketed for young adults that treated young adults like intelligent, erudite, thoughtful people. And that changed things for me. So I think she's still alive. So I'd love to invite her. And I guess the final person would probably be, okay, it's a toss up between Jane Austen
Hmm.
and George Eliot.
Hmm.
Mostly
Oh,
just because, those are women that, again, were authors in a time when women weren't authors.
right,
And I would
right.
just love to speak to them about what it was like in their time, having like being able to craft such stories that speak to people centuries later and what it was like at the time and how does it feel now. And I just, yeah, those are the people that I would love. I would give anything to shake Milena's hand and just tell her you did good.
My guest has been Christine Estima, playwright, novelist, and performer. First and foremost, though, a novelist. Letters to Kafka is coming in September. You can pre-order it right now. And her debut book, the Syrian Ladies Benevolent Society, you can buy it now. November 2023, it was published. It's available everywhere. And by the way, there is a link to Christine's website where you can learn more about her and take a measure of the books that she's written. And and hopefully go ahead and purchase those books. Again, if you do nothing else, look at the covers. Okay, the covers, as we were talking about earlier, they're really powerful. They're sexy. They're powerful. And I think it might just be the cover style for all of Christine's books to come. Christine, really appreciate you taking the time. You've been really energetic and really generous with your answers. Thank you for
Thank
coming
you.
on the program.
I had such a good time. Thanks for inviting me.